And a very good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today, where we're going to be talking about taking an intelligence approach to cyber and threat management. I'm delighted to be joined here in the studio by Archie Krishna, who runs our advisory business in Europe, and Adam Gray, who is our head of cyber and threat management here in BT Security. So today we're going to be talking in detail and taking an intelligence-led approach to threat management, using intelligence to better understand the behaviour of adversaries, the threats facing your business, and how you can maximise the impact and value of the investments that you've made. I'm going to really cover over the next 30 minutes how to understand the adversary and their behaviour and why it matters to you and your business, how to work out the biggest threats, and how to get to grips with the ever-increasing and expanding threat surface of your organisations, how to align the security controls and identify, most importantly, where gaps exist in those that could be exploited, the best ways to prioritise your strategic and roadmap activities to achieve your overall business goals, and finally, ensuring that the huge amount that we all invest in security controls are really focused on the key threats, the threats that really matter to your business to deliver maximum value. So throughout this, please use the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the webinar screen to ask any questions that we will do our best to answer at the end of this webinar. So first of all, Adam, I'd like to turn to you and ask really, why is it important to understand how adversaries behave?
So this is something that I'm quite passionate about, Tris, and I believe that understanding of adversary behaviour needs to be baked into security strategy, and we think it's critical because it helps us to align the controls and monitoring that happens, that occurs. And I wanted to sort of address a little bit about what we mean by adversary behaviour. So there's kind of two schools of thought within threat intelligence. One is the indicators of compromise type intelligence that tells us a point in time about what an adversary is doing. But then there's kind of the behavioural element to that to understand how an adversary operates. And I think the pyramid of pain, which people might be reasonably au fait with on this call, on this video, we're thinking of the summit of that pyramid. So the tactics, techniques, and procedures that adversaries are using to achieve their objectives. And that, again, as I say, it helps us to align the things that we do as part of that security strategy to the adversary behaviours.
Good. And what is it we can really do to start to understand the mindset of the adversary?
So there's a kind of spectrum to that answer, Tris. As we know, all organisations are different. They have different levels of capability, different maturities, access to different datas, and it's really for the organisation to make a determination of what they have access to and what they can see in the threat intelligence landscape. But ultimately, in BT, we recommend that we take a structured approach to threat modelling using that intelligence. And what I mean by that is to try and understand the who, the what, the why, and the how of the adversaries. So who they are, what they are attempting to achieve, why they are attempting to achieve it. Motivations are a really, really critical point. And then ultimately how they go ahead and achieve that. And so, by doing that, taking a look at the intelligence that you have access to, I mean, there's quite a lot out there, various different things, analysing that intelligence and trying to add a consistency to it by introducing a way to extract the key pieces of information from it. And we do that by aligning to TTPs, and in BT we use the MITRE ATT&CK framework to do that. We're big fans of MITRE ATT&CK here at BT. And an example of where we've used that recently, there was a large-scale political event that happened recently which caused some tensions between two specific regions, and we were aware that it was likely to cause increased cyber activity. And so as BT, the intelligence team worked to understand the threat actors from that specific region, and extract and gather together the tactics, techniques that they are using to achieve their objective. and ensure that we had controls and monitoring in place should that cyber attack happen, essentially. And this is something that all organisations can kind of mirror, gathering together the intelligence, going through some structured threat modelling to apply TTPs to it, and then ensuring that the controls and monitoring that's aligned to it is sufficient. In BT, we're a large multinational. We've got a reach across lots and lots of different countries. We're a CNI in the UK, and we provide tech and network services across that. So we've got a pretty impressive and unique standpoint for that one. And our threat intelligence team are continually doing this. They are looking at the intelligence, making sure that we have an accurate view of what's happening and applying that kind of metadata to it about tactics, techniques and procedures. And we don't just do that, we also add verticals and geographies so that we can build trends.
Very interesting, and it's a good insight into the tools and techniques to really find out more about the adversaries. And I know in that example that we've used it internally, haven't we, to look at actually the threats that affect BT and how we protect ourselves as an organisation, but equally using the same methodologies with our customers to ensure that both BT and our customers are best protected. What I'd like to think about now is really about how we make it hard for adversaries to come and carry out cyber attacks, both against us and our customers.
If you start to think about the adversary in terms of a business, and they have a business model and a cost of operation to the types of things that they want to achieve. And so by trying to elevate the controls and monitoring that we have up into the behavioural space, it makes it more expensive for them to achieve the objective. We're looking to push up the cost of their operation so that we become a less attractive target to these specific groups. And so by doing that and having the behaviours, understanding them and making it difficult for them, we can really, make it more difficult for the attackers.
Absolutely. Make it more expensive means they'll try for other targets, etc. Adam, I'd like to think a little bit about some of the threats now. So why is it important to work out what is and what isn't important when it comes to threats in a particular sector or region?
Really good question. It's something that we get from our clients all the time, Tris. I mentioned earlier that we use MITRE's attack framework to use as that kind of common language and taxonomy that sits describing the adversary behaviours. But that's quite a big body of work. It's got 13 or so tactics in it, and there's a number of techniques, and it describes the life cycle of an attacker and how they achieve their objectives. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that we don't all live in a world of unlimited resources, right? We've got cost pressures, unlimited resources, and so being able to prioritise the specific threats that target you as an organisation is really important. And we can do that a number of ways. It may be the sophistication of the adversary or using the vertical and geographic model that we discussed earlier.
Yeah. So I know that you and your team work extensively across the globe in pretty much every vertical in every region. How are you seeing the different attack groups targeting particular verticals or sectors?
Yeah, as I said earlier, by understanding the motivation of the attackers, each of the attack groups have slightly different attack motivations. So we work with banks and organisations in the financial services, and they are specifically worried about organisations that are or attack groups that are trying to achieve the objective of financial gain, whereas there are pharmaceuticals, for instance, where they would typically be more worried about intellectual property. And so understanding those motivations and then from that how they achieve that objective allows us to then prioritise that, and we can focus on the key things.
Yeah. Good, thank you, Adam. Artie, I'd like to turn to you now and talk a bit about the attack surface. So we hear a lot about the attack surface for organisations, but what do you think it really means in your engagement with clients in the subject of threat management?
Well, what we see with our customers, Tris, is we think of attack surface as really being a sum total of all the vulnerabilities that exist in an organization's real estate. When we think of the attack surface, it comes in multiple flavors, right? It is very internal to the customer. It can be very external. It is physical, which is within the physical parameters of the organization, or it can be digital. But it is important to always understand that one needs to have a good visibility of the attack surface. If you look at all our customers, they're large multinationals. Obviously, a large organization is going to have a very broad and diverse attack surface.
Absolutely.
To get a full view of the attack surface itself is a challenge. And attack vectors, attackers are constantly looking at the weakest links to try and come into the organization. They're trying to look, as Adam alluded to, they're trying to find the cheapest ways to come into the organization's perimeters. So to have the good visibility is one thing, but on the other end, it's also important to try and understand it from an attacker's perspective. So, again, looking at prioritized threats, if you really understood the threats which existed for your organization, if you could prioritize them, then it gives you a completely different view of how the attack surface looks like. So, for instance, if you're seeing a lot of, let's say, spear phishing attacks, that really gives you an idea of where you need to be channelizing your investments, right? So you're probably looking at investing more on training your workforce to try and protect themselves from phishing attacks, for instance. So it's important not only to have the internal view, but also the external view of how an attacker actually looks at the attack surface.
Very interesting. And we hear a lot about the attack surface continually evolving with organisations investing in new tools and processes. How do you see that changing?
All the time, right?
Yeah.
This is something we always hear from our customers. So as the physical and the IT boundaries of the organization moves, the attack surface also moves along with it. So we have a lot of customers who are embarking on their digitalization journey. They're investing a lot on their IoT programs. Obviously, there is the push to move into the cloud for cost considerations. And as that happens, as their attack surface, as the IT perimeter broadens, the attack surface also goes along with it. And an interesting aspect to it is that even if your attack surface hasn't changed from the external point of view, it's important to understand how it moves internally. So once an attacker gets in, it's useful to understand how they're actually trying to move laterally within the organization. So the attack surface is constantly changing. One of the interesting conversations I was having the other day is, a customer trying to really develop a lot of in-house applications. They have their DevOps team, and then now the focus is really on trying to understand how they could actually do secure coding, for instance, right? Yeah. So that tries to keep the attack surface to a minimum.
That's interesting. And I think when you look at the digital transformation that every business is going through, large or small, changes in the ways of working, adoption of software-defined networking, SD-WANs, cloud, means that attack surface is forever evolving and changing.
Absolutely.
Which is good. So I think given all that and the landscape of it, Adam, how should our customers stay ahead in that dynamic and changing landscape?
So it is challenging, Tris. You've mentioned it, and I think we need to look at it in kind of two ways. So what I talked about was the threats and the motivations of the attackers and how they are continually evolving. Organisations need to keep scanning how that is changing, how that landscape evolves. So on one hand, we've got the attacker and the changes that happen there. And then, as Artie said, we've got the estate and the changes to the estate and the strategies and digital transformations that organisations are undergoing. And we need to stay on top of those two things and make sure that they are both addressed hand in glove, essentially, so that we've got understanding of the threat, understanding of the change in the estate, and making sure that our controls and the monitoring and the strategies that we have in place are aligned to them. There's a really good kind of Bear Grylls quote. You've got to improvise, adapt, overcome, and remain agile is probably the thing. So in any sort of strategy, baking in that agility so that when things change, the strategies and the programs that sit within that can change as well.
And fundamentally, security should be there to enable a business in a secure way and not disable one. Artie, I'd like to think a little bit now about how within organisations we prioritise the key business objectives with also the technical ones in terms of implementing security controls. We often see a lot of tension between the two.
Something, again, we see all the time. I think the fundamental challenge here is that we've got two aspects. And most of our customers are beginning to looking at the threat intelligence lifecycle management as an end-to-end issue. So there is the management component to it, there is the technological aspect to it. The management component is everything about the preparation that goes in, right? To start with, you need to have the management buy-in. You need to get your fundamentals in place. You need to understand where your assets are, what your assets are, where your vulnerabilities, the attack surface, which we talked about, and really what is the risk that my organization faces at this point in time and going forward in the future. And once that's sorted, it's probably then you begin to think about where I'm going to get my intelligent feeds from. And you need to decide where do you get these feeds from and who's going to consume this within the organization. To give you an example, if I had a team which is going to be doing digital forensics, for instance, they could do with a slight delay with the feeds, right? They could have one every 24 hours. But if I had the SOC analyst looking at the feeds, then he probably needs to have live data. So those type of decisions really come prior to really bringing the technological question. And once that's set, which in fact takes quite a lot of planning, as you can imagine.
Absolutely.
You have to think about the technology and how you begin to put that into place. To start with, right, you need to understand where the feeds come from. So we have a number of vendors which provide feeds today. The choice is plenty. But if you look at the research, it says that the amount of overlap that you have between different feeds is minimal. So we have customers who are beginning to think about, where should my feeds be coming from? I would prioritize one vendor, for instance, and then I would try and see what are the other feeds I would need to sort of complement that. And you could have mailing list, in-house intelligence, think tanks, right? A variety of sources from where you get your information. That's the starting part. But once you've done that, you need to, again, reiterating what Adam just said, you need to really have a mechanism to be able to collate it, remove all the noise, easier said than done.
Absolutely.
Right? Remove all the noise and make sure that you can actually have a context attached to it. So that's what we call as contextualization, which is, if I see an attack coming from a certain IP address, I need to know more about it. What's the IP address? Where is it coming from? Who's behind it? What is the damage they're trying to create? Which vulnerabilities they're trying to exploit, right? So really tying in those pieces of information and bringing the entire context to it. And after that, after you've done that, and then you think about, what do I do now with this information? It has to be actionable. A lot of customers, I think, are very keen to understand when they get these feeds, right? What do we do with it? So it could be as simple as putting in a patch or opening up a firewall rule, putting in a new firewall rule. But really, you need to be able to understand what do I do with this information and how do I actually react to something like that when this happens. And once that's done, the natural next phase would be, could I automate this process, right? So automation is key. I need to relieve my resources of all the workload of having to do the repetitive tasks. So as I automate, we need to make sure that we are pushing those feeds to the decision engines within the real estate. So it could be your IDSs, the IPSs, the firewalls, to make sure that they capture the feeds, but also they make those decisions in a timely manner. So that tends to sum up the life cycle, right? But in Europe, being more of a manufacturing-focused organizations that we have the IoT, connected cars, connected trucks, connected factories, essentially means we are extending the problem to the OT space as well, which means we're going to have more data, we're going to have more noise, and a lot more risks, which are probably more critical. And the difficulty really is to begin to understand, how do I discern a certain event as being good behavior or an adverse behavior, right? So those types of decisions have to be codified. But once you've done that, then you're doing the threat intelligence life cycle for the IT world and the OT world together. So, that is a big program in itself.
Massive challenges as well. Absolutely. In achieving it. And as you say, supply chain, some customers have many tens of thousands of suppliers. Adam, just like to think a bit about value for money here. So we all invest as organisations in security controls and capability, but we've got to get the best value from it, so bang for buck. What do you see as being the best way of achieving that?
Well, a common theme that we see in the industry in security is that, and I'm sure RT will agree with this, is that often organisations see security as a technology issue that can be solved with technology. And this often leads to a mismatch in resources, because often those decisions that are made about the things that need to be procured are based on the latest hack or the latest media report, or even worse, the latest piece of technology that claims to solve everybody's problems in one go. And we see that this results in resources being overspent in some areas and underspent in other areas. So by taking the approach of prioritising the threats and understanding how they apply to your estate, we can ensure that the security spending strategy is aligned to provide the most value that's aligned to that. And it allows us to make more strategic decisions, moving away from the kind of tactical mitigations to more strategic and long-term mitigations.
And through your work, have you got a good example of where you've applied that and seen it work?
Yes, absolutely, Tris. So we work across a number of clients across the globe, but one specific example is a large financial services organisation. They came to BT because they wanted us to help them with security monitoring, so cyber monitoring, and they were a really mature organisation, so they had everything that you would expect from a really good cyber programme, and they were keen to take a threat-led approach to their capability. And so our strategies and the methodology that we've talked about kind of aligned really nicely. So we worked using the intelligence that BT's got at its disposal, and worked with their intelligence teams to understand the adversaries that were targeting them, and then being able to sort of decompose that into the tactics and techniques that we were going to be targeting, the most prioritised ones, and that kind of ran as a common theme and a common language throughout the discussions and the work that we did with them, and it enabled everybody to extract the most value from that particular programme.
Yeah, and I know that particular example was very successful. And Arti, in your experience in Europe, a similar example?
Well, we have customers who are in financial services, to logistics, to manufacturing, to pharma. And we see customers at varying levels of maturity, some more, some less. But I think the key value addition that we bring is that of personalizing the service. So threat intelligence can be extremely personal depending on the type of business the organization is in, and depending on the specific risks and threats the organization thinks are key for its business. And where we try, so we've had one of our large customers, what we've tried to do for them is really take the threat intelligence program and sort of tightly integrate it within the wider security architecture that they have. Threat intelligence programs don't work well in silos, right? So it's important that we have a holistic view of the entire architecture and sort of bringing in really closely, coupling it very tight with the other investments, helps them optimize the other investments as well. And I think the other area where it's key to understand that the use cases that we develop for one organization isn't necessarily relevant for the other, right? So we really work with, I would think of as the customization, the personalization element of trying to understand, okay, what do we need to do for this customer with their existing security architecture for their specific wants? And that's where majority of, I think, the thinking goes in.
Yeah, and I think what you've said is really true in that you've got to look at it with the people, the process, the physical, the tooling, look at that holistically to deliver the benefit to the organisation. Well, thank you. So that kind of sums up the key questions I had for both Adam and Arti. Taking an intelligence-led approach in BT's opinion, is fundamental to staying ahead with a significant and very challenging security landscape. Delivering and ensuring the security strategies both address the evolving threats, but also fundamentally enabling business requirements and the business strategies. So recognising the threat surface of the organisation and control gaps is fundamental, and addressing those gaps is the key thing that we see in ensuring that adversaries can't get a foothold in organisations. Prioritising strategic initiatives to align to business goals and ensuring that investments are focused on the key threats to get value. Not all the threats, but the ones that particularly face organisations and businesses. So I hope you've learnt a bit more about how we see and understand the adversary behaviour and determine the biggest threats to your businesses based upon real-world tactics and techniques and procedures. So, before we close the call, we'd like to just go on and look at some Q&A. We've had a few questions that have come through already. The first one here is for Adam, it's for you. It talks a bit about the attack framework, MITRE ATT&CK framework. Can you tell me a little bit about what this actually is?
So, MITRE ATT&CK framework is a fantastic resource. It's something that we're quite passionate about in BT and we've been using for a number of years. It's a globally accessible knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques. And the reason that we like it so much is that it's based on real-world observations. So it's all grounded in real intelligence. It describes the behaviours of the organisations, as I said, and it's becoming quite well respected and prevalent within the security industry. So we can use it internally in BT to talk about threats in that common language with the taxonomy that underpins it. But then also when we start to talk to our clients, people are becoming increasingly aware of it and supportive of it. So it's a fantastic resource. I don't recommend everybody should go out and look into MITRE ATT&CK.
We certainly do, and we use it as the pivot point for
They've
pretty much all.
released the IoT version.
Yeah. It's developing all the time and it's becoming really big.
It's a great way of articulating the threats in a comprehensive and staged manner. Next question comes in. This one's for you, Artie, and it talks a bit about the threat intelligence lifecycle. How do commercial threat intelligence platforms compare against those of open source?
Interesting one. So if we look at the open source intelligence platforms, obvious benefit to it is the cost advantage. The upfront costs are low. But also open source platforms tend to typically address specific requirements. So it could be looking at either DDoS as a specific requirement or specific malware. And whereas if you look at the more commercial tools, they're more holistic in nature. So what's important to recognize is that open source intelligence platforms might be a good start, but you have to bear in mind the ongoing resource overhead, either as in-house or contracted resources you may need to have in order to be able to cater it and personalize it, what I talked about earlier, personalize it to fit the organization's needs. So really a tip would be, it could be a combination of both, but really a tip from us would be, I think, to make a checklist. And this is a useful exercise, right? To really make a checklist to try and understand what is it that you want out of the threat intelligence platform. What sort of threats are you looking at addressing? What requirements does it need to meet? And once you have that, you can shortlist something that suits you, but always bear in mind the resource overhead that will come once you begin to implement and operationalize the threat intelligence platform. So
very good. Thank you very much. So, unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for questions. Artie, Adam, thank you very much for joining me here in the studio. If you have any other questions offline, then please just follow up with the Q&A function. And want to extend my big thank you for watching this webinar. And until next time, goodbye.